Morning, a very good afternoon to one and all present here. I welcome you all to the final debate for the 7th Claude Martin debate and the Bolognese quiz. As we all know that the debate is between Mayo College Ajmer and La Martin for Girls Kolkata. Before I begin, I would like to introduce the chairperson for today's debate, Ms. Isha Yadav. Ms. Isha Yadav is an assistant professor of psychology at Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, National Law University, Lucknow. She's an alumna of Lolato College, Lucknow, and Lady Shri Ram College for Women, New Delhi. She started her career in the corporate sector as a psychotherapist and a consumer behavior analyst before taking up research and academics as a full-time career. She is currently pursuing her doctoral research in sexuality, parenting, and child psychology. She is a travel enthusiast, a plant lover, and a struggling animal parent. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for accepting our invite as a chairperson. As the timekeeper for today's debate, we have Mr. Harpreet Singh. Mr. Harpreet Singh, as you all know, is a teacher at La Martiniere and sir is very hardworking. So we thought that there's no person better than Mr. Harpreet Singh to timekeep today's debate. I now hand over the proceedings to Ms. Isha Yadav so that we can go on with this final debate. Ma'am, you have the floor.
Thank you, Revant. A very good afternoon to all of you. And I'd also like to extend a heartfelt welcome to all the participants and all the judges here to the 7th edition of the Claude Martin Debate 2021. I'd like to begin by welcoming all the judges that we have on the panel today. I'd like to thank all the judges. We're very grateful to all the judges for having graciously accepted this invitation and making time for us today for judging this debate. On the panel of the judges, we have Mrs. S. Raha. Mrs. Raha has been a senior English teacher for about 40 years. She was the HOD and the coordinator at St. Thomas's Girls' School, Kolkata. At present, she is the academic advisor at Vivekananda Mission School, Kolkata. She was a teacher trainer in the B.Ed department of the St. Xavier's College, Kolkata for 30 years, and also served as deputy head, workshop director, facilitator, and evaluator of the B.Ed program of the Indira Gandhi National Open University. She is closely associated with the CISCE and has held teacher training workshops all over the country. She has worked as a consultant with several schools. She is also a recipient of the State Award for Teaching. She has written readers for middle school children. She is very interested in creative writing, dramatics, and public speaking. I welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Mr. K. Noble as our judge with us today. Mr. Noble is an educationist and has trained employees in multinational corporations. Some of his school accomplishments include Best Actor, Best Singer, Best Musician, Best Artist, and Best Quizzer. In addition, Mr. Noble was the debating champion of St. Joseph's College, Nainital, and St. Joseph's College, Allahabad. He then went on to represent St. Stephen's College, Delhi in several national debates. Mr. Noble has left the corporate arena where he was a training leader to come back home to educational institutes. He is now principal at Tunbridge High School, Bangalore. Besides being an educator and a learner, Mr. Noble loves to play the guitar and occasionally moonlights as the Elvis impersonator. He is the head guitarist of the group Principals of Rock, a rock band comprising of school principals across India. Welcome, sir, and thank you for joining us today. Next on our panel of judges, as our third judge, we have Mr. L. Christopher Contino. Sir is a family man who has 41 years experience in education as a teacher in schools, Hislop College and the University of Nagpur. He was a principal of Barnes High School and Junior College, Devlali. He rounded up his career as Director, Universal Education, Nasik Operations. During his career, Sir has been an HRD trainer and resource person for leadership training. He has traveled extensively from Hawaii to New Zealand, Australia, and the UAE. He has been socially active in the AIAI YMCA and was awarded Rotary's Nation Builder Award in 2015. He's a nature lover, an ardent gardener, a voracious reader, and an artist. I welcome you on board, sir, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you for making time for us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Honored.
So moving on with the debate, the topic for the debate today is this House believes that no nation can survive being isolated. Proposing the motion today, we have the Mayo College Ajmer. On the Mayo College Ajmer debate team, we have Aviral Narang as our principal speaker. As the second speaker, we have Abir Srivastav. As the third speaker, we have Raghav Singh Ranawat, and Vasu Sachdeva is the fourth speaker for Mayo College Ajmer. Opposing the motion is La Martiniere for Girls College, Kolkata. Representing La Martiniere for Girls, Kolkata, we have the principal speaker, Anushka Agarwala, the second speaker, Ria Martha Cherian. Sanaya Tulsian is the third speaker for La Martiniere for Girls, Kolkata, and the fourth speaker, we have Reva Sharma. Welcome to all the participants. For the benefit of all the participants, all the judges and everyone who's watching, I would want to quickly take you through the rules of the debate. Each team shall be represented by one principal speaker and two supporting speakers. The fourth speaker shall function in the role of a reserve speaker. The two principal speakers shall be allowed 5 minutes each to put forth their arguments. A warning bell will ring 1 minute before the time up. So after 4 minutes, the first warning bell will ring, and the final bell shall be rung when the speaker's time is up. The two other speakers, so the second and the third speaker from each side, will be given 4 minutes to speak. They will, however, take no part in the summing up. They can only help the main speaker by giving the speaker's points to be used in the summing up. A warning bell will ring 1 minute before the time is up for each speaker. The final bell shall be rung when the time is up. After all the speakers have represented their arguments, the principal speaker of each team shall be given 4 minutes to sum up the argument of the team. The principal speaker of the opposition shall sum up first. At the end of each speech, except the summing up speeches, a period of 2 minutes shall be allotted to each speaker for rebuttal, that is to answer questions by members of the opposing team. The questions shall be asked by a virtual show of hands, which shall be addressed by the chairperson. The questions must be confined to the substance of the speech, but immediately precede each rebuttal process. A maximum of 2 questions may be asked for each rebuttal. Cross-questioning shall not be permitted. Only the time taken to answer the questions shall be taken into account. The questions themselves shall not be included in the 2 minutes allotted for the rebuttal. Only since marks shall be provided for the questions asked by the opposing speakers, the quality of the questions posed shall be taken into account. The fourth speaker of each team will put forward additional arguments upon the conclusion of the overall summing up. This shall be for 2 minutes. A warning bell will ring 1 minute before the time is up for each speaker. The final bell shall be rung when the time is up. Speakers shall be permitted the use of references, prompt cards, and may refer to their notes. However, continuous reading shall be penalized. Marks shall be allotted as follows. So I'll quickly list down the breakup of marks for everyone. The marks for the content is 25 points, delivery 5 points, refutation 10 points, summing up by the opening speaker 10 points, general impression of the team 5 points, and question asked additional 5 points. Exceeding the time limit may be penalized. So beginning with the debate, I would now like to call upon the principal speaker of the proposition, Aviral Narang, to represent his views on the topic. Aviral?
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I'll start my case in 3, 2, 1. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. The motion today is that this House believes that no nation can survive being isolated. Before we start on with the debate, we have a few key definitions that need to be defined for the benefit of the debate. The first key definition that needs to be defined is of the word nation. Nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular country or territory which has been internationally recognized. The second key term that we wish to discuss about is the word survive. In the context of the propositions debate today, it is to continue or to function and prosper at the same time. Death of a country is not the removal of a country from the world map, ladies and gentlemen. It means the deterioration in the quality of life, political instability, not having stable work for all, not giving the basic human rights to all the humans, etc. Right? With that being sorted, we'll come on to a third key term, that is the word isolated. The policy or doctrine of isolating one's country from the affairs of other nations by declining to enter into alliances, foreign economic commitments, international agreements, etc., seeking to divert the entire efforts of one's country to its own advancement and remain at peace by avoiding foreign entanglements and responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to make it clear for the benefit of this debate that there is a difference between self-reliance and isolation. If you're self-reliant, you're able to do things and make decisions by yourself without needing other people to help you, while isolation has already been defined. By isolation, we mean total isolation and not partial isolation. We are at a point in history, ladies and gentlemen, where countries will need to have relationships across a broad spectrum. We have to accept the fact that we neither live in a unipolar or in a bipolar world. In Southeast Asia, ladies and gentlemen, 10 countries decided to work as a group, and the net result which we see today is stability and prosperity. Globalization today aims to benefit individual economies across the world by making markets more efficient, by increasing the competition, by limiting military conflicts, and spreading wealth more equally to each country. Globalization is about the interconnectedness of the people and businesses across the world, ladies and gentlemen, and that eventually leads to global cultural, political, and economic integration. It is the ability to move and communicate easily with all others in the world in order to conduct business internationally. The airplane, the telephone, and the internet are just three inventions which are which give us a huge attribute to the spread of globalization. Now, I would like to tell you about our case division of the side proposition, ladies and gentlemen. The first speaker, that is me, would speak to you about how a country, when isolated, would fail to survive when they isolate themselves. To reiterate on the meaning of survive, survive is to continue to function and prosper. The second speaker would furthermore elaborate on the case set up by the first speaker, that is me, and also talk to you about how the support from other countries helps a country to survive and how isolation affects the basic structure of a country's survival. Coming on to my constructive case now. I'm going to talk about how is it not economically feasible. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to show to you how isolation of a country will not only affect the single country that is being isolated, but in fact the whole world. Let's take example of the USA's exit from the Paris Agreement. USA being one of the biggest donators in the Paris Agreement, USA pulled out, right? But ladies and gentlemen, this is only a single agreement that they pulled out of, not all the agreements, and we can already see the repercussions that took place, right? With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, my question to the side opposition is that if the USA today pulls out of all the international treaties that they're a part of, that they pull out of all the declarations that they've been a part of, would the whole world be affected and not just a country? This would, of course, affect the whole world, ladies and gentlemen, but it will also deteriorate the conditions of almost all the countries that are there today. For them, the survival would be difficult. Coming on to a more general view, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the imbalance of natural resources. We know that a single country does not have all the necessary resources that are required for the survival of a country. The distribution of natural resources depends upon many physical factors like land, climate, and altitude. The distribution of resources is unequal because these factors differ from place to place on this earth. Almost all the countries in the world look towards the Middle East for their oil reserves. A lot of other reserves are only available at some select countries. And if a country decides to isolate themselves, it would lead to a lot of difficulty for getting the basic resources. Some countries would fail just because of the lack of resources. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I will show you how the economy would fall. Ladies and gentlemen, because MNCs play such a huge role in the world today, if MNCs back out of a country, if tourism is stopped in a country, export is stopped, import of a lot of necessary as well as luxury products is stopped, which would ultimately lead to inflation in the country and then failing of the economy, ladies and gentlemen. This would further lead on to the failing of a government, ladies and gentlemen, and would lead on to a dystopian society, which makes me come on to my second argument. How is it not morally feasible? The role of a government is to ensure that the people in their country receive the best opportunities, they receive the best living conditions, the best economy, and the best of everything that a government can promise. But with becoming isolated, ladies and gentlemen, the whole role of a government changes to that as that of a dictator. This would also lead to a loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs and hence would devalue the life of people, right? With no proper job security, with no proper economic system in effect, the country is bound to collapse and hence it would end up in devaluing the people's lives. And that is how, ladies and gentlemen, the side proposition shows how a country would fail to survive. The second speaker will take up more points. Proud to propose.
Thank you, Avral. I see that we have a couple of questions for you already. I invite Sanaya to ask her question, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and thank you, sir, for your speech. So, considering the fact that Japan spent over 200 years from the mid-17th to the mid-19th centuries with effectively closed borders and functioning in isolation, and during this very period, Japan developed thriving cities, castles, towns, etc. Thus, how do you justify your stance that isolation brings the downfall of a country or a nation?
Right, ma'am. I'll answer that question in a very simple sentence. We are not living in the 1700s or the 1900s. We live in the 21st century, ma'am. And globalization right now is something that is very important for all of us. During that time, there were not the jobs that we have right now did not exist. The people that live in the conditions right now did not exist. The people at that time, those who were alive at that time, had conditions that were different from the ones that we are in currently. They did not have the means to actually prosper as much as we can today. And they did not have a proper government at that time, ma'am. They had a proper, as I said, they had a monarchy there. We are talking about a democratic government. We are talking about the world that we live in. And I believe that it is a duty of the government to promise us everything that is possible. The interculture affairs, the tourism would be stopped. There would be a lot of repercussions, ma'am. The world would go into war. There would be civil wars within the countries if we do not allow globalization to take place.
For the second question of the rebuttal, I invite Reva to go ahead and ask her question.
So twice in your speech, you reiterated that to survive means to prosper. But considering that in the wake of the Great Depression and under the presidency of Roosevelt in the United States, the US economy flourished under the New Deal, even though the 1930s happened to be an isolationist period for the USA. And so before you escape the question with globalization, I hope you understand that that concept was still very much prevalent in the 1900s. So how do you justify saying that isolation kills nations?
Again, ma'am, we talked about how total isolation kills nations and not how partial isolation kills nations, right? When you talk about the Great Depression and the period following the Great Depression, USA went into partial isolation and not a total isolation. The cases that we mentioned today was about how it would affect the world economy and how it would affect eventually the whole world and each country personally. And also, ma'am, the conditions that were present in the 1930s are not the conditions that are present in the year 2021. We are in the 21st century, ma'am. We have a lot of technology. We have a lot of advancements in every sphere possible that were not available in the 1930s. I believe that I have answered your question, ma'am. Thank you.
Just a mention here, the speaker has exceeded the time limit by 15 seconds. The principal speaker has exceeded the time by 15 seconds. Judges, please make a note.
Thank you. May I now invite the principal speaker of the opposition, Anushka Agarwala, to present her views on the topic.
Thank you, ma'am. 1776, isolation from the wars in Europe. 1801, Thomas Jefferson says that this nation will never have an alliance with another. 1832, James Monroe refuses to engage in the chaos in Europe. 1916, a man storms through Woodrow Wilson's parliament with a banner saying, "Keep us out of war." 1929, the New Deal, not joining the League of Nations. Isolation until they were attacked first under the rule of Roosevelt. Members of the House, did you identify this country? This very country, the United States of America, having followed the policy of isolation from 1976 to 1939 is today a superpower. It still exists. A very good afternoon to the members of the House, members of the jury, my respected chairperson, and my most formidable opponents. The motion before this August House reads that no nation can survive without being isolated. And I, as lead speaker of side opposition, stand here firmly opposing the motion. Before I delve into my twofold constructive, allow me to harp on certain keywords in today's motion, which have been grossly misinterpreted by the proposition. The word motion, members of the House, in today's debate reads a stable community of people which has been formed on the basis of a common language, territory, ethnicity, history, and culture. It is defined as a mobilized, institutionalized ethnic group. A nation, members of the House, cannot be confused with a state. According to revered political scientist Dr. Garner, a state is one which contains the following four pillars: territory, sovereignty, people, and government. According to Garner, a state is a community of people more or less numerous, absorbed in a definite area which is internationally recognized and which has a government to which the body of inhabitants render habitual obedience. Members of the House, that being said, India, the Republic of India, is a state, but anybody belonging to Indian origin, even if they are NRIs, belong to the Indian nation. That, members of the House, brings about the partial aspect of isolation of a community. Members of the House, allow me to move into the next keyword of today's motion, the word survive. The word survive in its very essence means to exist and not be completely destroyed. The word isolated, members of the House, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, in two contexts. Sociologically means a concept of minimum contact with other societies, and politically, members of the House, is a lack of participation in international politics. That being established, we need to realize that the word no in today's motion is a very important and crucial word. The word no brings out this absolute burden of side proposition, which they completely negated. The burden of side proposition today is to prove to us that absolutely no community or nation in the history of humankind, in the inception of humankind, present or in the past, has ever existed in any form of isolation. On the contrary, if today we as side opposition can give you one single example of a community of individuals who in the past or the present followed the policy of isolation and were not completely destroyed in their entirety, then this motion falls flat on its face. The lead speaker of side proposition came up here and already conceded to the existence of Japan prospering under the concept of isolation. And therefore, at the very outset of this debate, they themselves have reiterated that one single example which we had to give you. And therefore, this motion has already fallen flat on its face. With that, members of the House, allow me to delve into my twofold constructive, which is built upon the very concept of partial and complete isolation. Coming to my first concept of partial isolation, members of the House, there have been communities and there have also been states who, via following the policy of sociological as well as political isolation, have conversely thrived as opposed to being disrupted. Take, for example, the United States. Take, for example, the Ottoman Empire from the 16th to the 18th century. The tribes of Africa before Europeans colonized them. Ethiopia, pre-Germany. The prosperity in Persia, or even the Harappans before the Aryans invaded us. Members of the House, they prospered without being attacked or without having any contact from any foreign body. Coming to my second constructive of total isolation. Uncontacted people are communities and groups of indigenous people who live without sustained contact to any other community in the world. This includes indigenous people who have voluntarily put themselves in total isolation. In 2013, there were thought to be roughly 150 uncontacted tribes worldwide, half of whom live in the Amazon forest at present. The Red Indians, the Kiwi in Australia. Recognizing the myriad of problems with contacting them, the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2009 and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 2013 introduced guidelines and recommendations absolutely establishing the human right of self-isolation. The very fact that these communities are existing and thriving has already made this motion fall flat on its face. With that, members of the House, my second speaker will be coming up here to you and proving to you how tribes continue to exist in self-isolation. And my third speaker will be walking us through the historical isolation which existed in the Indian independence movement, which led to the building of an Indian nation. With that, members of the House, I'd like to rest my case, but not my stance.
The speaker has exceeded the time limit by 35 seconds.
Thank you. I now invite questions for the rebuttal. And as a first question, we have Raghav Ranawat. Raghav, go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you, Chairperson, for the floor. Respected speaker, I was very clearly listening to your speech, and to my surprise, I heard an example of Germany. And seeing that your debate is based in the past, you have mentioned how Germany had thrived in the concept of self-isolation, and Germany had only adapted self-isolation in the Nazi period. Do you believe the Nazi period was one ethical, second compatible to what the current beliefs of isolation are, and third of all, your definition of the Cambridge you have defined the term survival in terms of the Cambridge dictionary, whereas your definition of the term isolation is nowhere in the Cambridge dictionary.
Sir, thank you for actually proving that you did not listen to my speech. The only place where I ever brought up Germany was in context of Abyssinia. You just allowed me to give you yet another example. I spoke of Ethiopia pre-Germany. I never said the word Nazi in my entire speech. Now let me remind you what Ethiopia was pre-Germany. Ethiopia was a thriving state in East Africa within itself, which produced all it required. It was self-sufficient, had its own navy, had its own military, and had its own cultural aspect. But when it was invaded by Germany, when it was no longer isolated, did Ethiopia become a colony? Did it become a European colony? You yet again went to give me an opportunity to give you yet another example, which has already made this motion fall flat on its face.
For the second question of the rebuttal, I invite Aviral Nara to ask his question.
Right, ma'am. I'll keep my question short and crisp. Can you please give me one example where a total isolation took place in the world we live in today? I'll repeat it. In the world we live in today, and a country survived.
Sir, again, you've confused nation with a state. And let me give you 150 examples of indigenous tribes in the Amazon rainforest, which are existing in complete and total isolation under the protection of the American Commission on Human Rights and the United Nations Human Rights Council Declaration.
Thank you, Anushka. I would now like to call upon the second speaker of the proposition, Abir Srivastav, to express his opinions on the topic.
Okay, greetings to the chair, our esteemed judges, the house, and our very worthy side opposition. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a little confused as to if we are sitting here debating with rational individuals or a set of people who are working towards making this a dystopian world. Ladies and gentlemen, today's recent events, not events that took place hundreds of years back, when there was no concept of a government or globalization that the side opposition has spoken about, completely ignoring the circumstances of the world we live in today, the world of the 21st century, because they've probably forgotten that times have changed. We no longer live in a world with the Harappan civilization and where Persia today is no longer a nation, giving us no example of a country, because I'm pretty sure their definition of a nation or a country is flawed here, whose isolationist and having thrived in recent times, because there is no country that has. Ladies and gentlemen, isolation is more often than not a mistake and an inviable condition resulting from failed policies. Cuba's emergence from decades of forced isolation is a victory for the island. Similarly, Israel's controversial policies and diplomacy risk has left the Jewish state unprecedentedly alone, and inward-looking policies in Russia and Turkey, driven largely by their leaders' ego, are unlikely to produce anything but harm. North Korea tried to follow complete isolation, ladies and gentlemen, but they failed and realized the need for trade. Albania tried it for a while, ladies and gentlemen, they tried it for a while, but they eventually fell apart. In an independent world, isolation is no longer a source of pride. On the contrary, it's a cause for concern. Nowhere is that more evident than Israel. Not even the country's technological wonder or its vibrant civil society can make up for its unappealing politics and policies. The result has been a dangerously rapid diminution of much needed Western support. Equally worrisome is the recent drift of former imperial powers, Russia and Turkey. Both countries' leaders, Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Turkish President, place their own power above their citizens' interests, and both are fanning the flames of misguided nationalism and religious chauvinism, surrounded by frightened courtiers whose main function has been to keep reality at bay. Ladies and gentlemen, even in times of economic or humanitarian crisis, countries need aid from other countries in order to survive and come out of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, if countries hadn't provided financial or humanitarian aid to countries like Liberia, when the people of the country were ravaged by a civil war and the entire country was vulnerable, or when the entire African continent was shook by the Ebola virus, there would be much more destruction and death than there was. If there was no intervention by the UN or the country or countries during the civil war in Sudan, which led to the formation of another country called South Sudan, dividing the country into two different countries in 2013, there would have been much more destruction and death in the countries as there was. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to understand how important cultural diversity and cultural exchange is, which isolation doesn't let happen. Through cultural exchange and diversity, we can learn from another, but first, we must have a level of understanding about each other. Cultural diversity is important because our world consists of various cultural, racial, and ethnic groups, and through cultural diversity and exchange, we get to learn about them, their beliefs, and their ideologies. Learning about other cultures helps us understand different perspectives within the world in which we live. It also helps us dispel negative within the world in which we live. It helps dispel negative stereotypes and personal biases about different groups. In addition, cultural diversity helps us recognize and respect ways of being that are not necessarily our own, so that we can interact with others and we can build bridges of trust, respect, and understanding across cultures. Furthermore, this diversity makes our world a more interesting place to live in, as people from diverse cultures contribute new language skills, new ways of thinking, knowledge, new cultures, and different experiences, which help in development of our society. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, presenting to you a case where we have proved how isolation goes against the basis of globalization and interdependence of countries, and the idea of a global village, because total isolation will stop all international trade, cultural exchange, and diversity, hence not allowing countries and the world to move forward, slow down economic, technological, social, and scientific advancement, which help us prosper and help in the development of and the advancement of the human race. Thank you. With that, I'm proud to propose.
The speaker exceeded the time limit by 45 seconds.
For the first question of the rebuttal, I invite Anushka Agarwala to ask her question.
Thank you, Chairperson, ma'am. Thank you for your speech, sir. Sir, you very well misconstrued the concept of a state and nation. But let me ask you a twofold question, since you misconstrued your own constructive. Sir, speaking of a nation, the Senegalese nation of over 60,000 individuals lives in complete isolation and is thriving in isolation. It is an uncontacted community. Speaking of a country, in your opinion, the country of Egypt or the country of Ethiopia, Egypt prior to the Greeks and Ethiopia prior to the Germans invading them in their own history, continue to thrive as civilizations. So how do you justify your extremely flawed stance?
I'm sorry, I think my internet connection is unstable. Could you please rephrase your question?
You misconstrued the concepts of a nation and a state. So let me ask you a question on both your misconstrued concepts. Coming to a nation, which is a community of people, the Senegalese nation of over 60,000 individuals, which is a tribal nation, continues to exist completely uncontacted by the outside world, and they continue to survive. Coming to the concept of a country, which you kept bringing up, the country of Ethiopia, with their capital at Addis Ababa, continued to thrive until the Germans invaded them. The country or the civilization of the ancient Egyptians continued to thrive until the Greeks invaded them. So how do you justify your stance?
Ma'am, first, I think you all have forgotten that here we are talking not about nations, but we're talking about countries. Second is that, ma'am, Egypt, like you said, how Egypt was flourishing before the Germans came in. I mean, I would love if you could probably stop giving sarcastic smiles and listen to what I'm saying. Is that the first thing you need to understand is that we are talking, like the side government has continuously been saying, of present times, the world we live in today. Before the Germans invaded Egypt, you need to start focusing on the 21st century, of what is happening in the 21st century, and not things that happened hundreds of years back, which the side opposition is completely failing to understand.
So we have Reva Sharma for the second question of the rebuttal. I invite Reva to go ahead and ask her question.
So, although historical evidence is very much relevant to any debate, I will humor you and ask you about a very much present day instance. Today, we are living in the midst of a global pandemic that has compelled all nations and all countries as well to go into a state of isolation. According to your stance, isolation kills nations. So, are you trying to tell us that because of this pandemic, every single nation in the world that has to go into isolation is not fated to survive? Is that the absurd notion that you are trying to propagate here today?
First, again, you spoke about historical events, which again, we're trying to convince the side opposition not to talk about. But anyway, ma'am, there is a difference between the isolation you are following during the pandemic, and there's a difference between a country going into isolation, cutting all, breaking all bilateral agreements, stopping trade with other countries. We are in isolation to stop the spread of a virus which is a threat to humankind. Your definition of isolation is flawed, because you don't understand that there's a basic difference between people and a country going into isolation to stop the spread of a virus which has a threat to humans, and a country going into isolation where they decide that they are not going to have ties with any country just so that they can improve their own country's present situation. You comparing a pandemic, a country going into isolation during a pandemic, and comparing a country going into isolation for trade, etc., is completely, it's shocking me how you're comparing the both of them. They're two different things. You can't compare the both of them.
Thank you, Abir. And I now invite the second speaker of the opposition, Ria Martha Cherian, to present her views on the topic.
Am I audible?
Yes, Ria, you're audible.
Thank you. The Sentinelese tribe, Japan, Korea, Bhutan, Paraguay, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. What do you, members of the House, notice in common with the names I just took? All of these nations have at one point or another been isolated and are very successfully still surviving. A very good afternoon, members of the House, members of the jury, Honorable Chairperson, and my most formidable opponents. The motion before us today reads that this House believes that no nation can survive being isolated, and I am here today as the second speaker for side opposition. My speech has been divided into three constructives, focusing on the tribal nations, the right to self-isolation, and various other historical examples on how nations have survived being isolated. Coming to my first constructive, the remote and coral fringe Sentinel Islands have made headlines multiple times. We've heard stories of American Christian missionaries having covert expeditions to convert its residents. We've also heard of how contact with the outside world has resulted in fatalities to the world's last Neolithic tribal nation. The complete isolation of the Sentinelese people means any contact with the outside world could put them at deadly risk of disease. And because they are likely to have no immunity to even common diseases such as the flu, contact could be deadly. We've heard of stories of the Sentinels attacking any form of visitors, and this, members of the House, stems from the fact that because of the actions of the British, because of multiple attempts of contact from the outside world, they are aware their lives are at danger. And simply to survive, they have chosen to self-isolate. When we look at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, we're reminded of the British colonial rule. British colonial excesses have completely whittled down the aboriginal population of the islands. More than 24 tribes existed 150 years ago, and today only 4 continue to exist. In the Andaman chain of the 4 tribes that survive, 2 were forcibly assimilated by the British and have become completely dependent on government aid and are continuing to vanish. In Brazil, 3/4 of the indigenous nations that opened up to the outside world have become extinct, and with the rest suffering catastrophic population declines. If these examples, member of the House, don't prove to you why this motion falls flat, today's motion definitely falls flat. This brings me to my second constructive, the right to self-isolation. This right has been upheld by countless organizations and countries. Today, members of the House side proposition completely ignores this right to self-isolation. The Organization of American States, the United Nations, India, Brazil, just to name a few, have upheld this right. For example, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Act of 1956 prohibits travel to the island, and any approach closer than 5 nautical miles is considered illegal. This was done in order to protect the resident tribes people. And this, members of the House, shows to you exactly how important the right to self-isolation is. And coming to my third and final constructive, when we see countries like Korea and Japan that chose to isolate, understand that they chose to isolate to protect themselves and their culture. They chose to shut out the increasing and dominating Western culture. And as a result, they have thrived. They built large cities, commodified agriculture, and most importantly, they preserved their culture. The fact that most nations that isolate did it to survive, and most nations survived while isolating, shows to you why this motion falls flat. Today, members of the House, the only argument that side proposition has brought forth is that we are speaking in the past. Considering the fact that the word being exists in today's motion, the word being connotates the past and the present, not the future, as suggested by side proposition, as suggested by that vague and irrelevant example of the United States, shows to you exactly why we have taken today's debate. And with that, I am proud to oppose. Thank you.
I invite Vasu Sachdeva to ask his first question for the rebuttal.
Thank you for the speech, ma'am. I'm considering the fact that you're again using historical evidence to compare two analogies of what happened in the past and in the present. Ma'am, you talked about how Andaman and Nicobar Islands once went into isolation and they thrived. Ma'am, my question to you is, if they once thrived, why aren't they still in isolation in the present century? There might be some reason, because they believe that isolation doesn't work in this globalized world. Why are the countries still not isolated if once they thrived in isolation?
So you clearly weren't listening to my speech when you asked this question. Firstly, understand that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were once in isolation and they were thriving during that point. The British came, assimilated them, and therefore they are no longer thriving. And now the Indian government has taken steps such as the Act of 1956 that has chosen to protect these people and chosen to isolate these people for the particular reason that they must continue to thrive.
The second question is by Raghav Ranawat. Raghav, go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Chair, for the floor. I have a very short question for you, and that is that in the middle of your speech, I heard that the Sentinelese tribe they have been thriving and they aren't contacted. I fail to understand, how are you so sure that they are thriving when you have already established that they are uncontacted? Can you predict what is happening there? Do you have some special intelligence there? Do you have robots there? So the whole question about them thriving with them being uncontacted is out of my ability of comprehension. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your question. So understand the fact that today in the motion, we see the word survive. The fact that the Sentinelese tribals are surviving means that they are thriving. The fact that they have isolated and they are continuously surviving, they are surviving in today's day and age, means that they are thriving. Therefore, sir, your question proves to us how today's motion falls flat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ria. I see Abir Srivastav's hand up, but I believe the rules allow for only 2 questions for the rebuttal. So Abir, we would not be taking your question. Yeah. All right. So next we have the third speaker for the proposition, Raghav Singh Ranawat, to express his views on the topic.
Thank you, Chair, for the recognition. I'll start my debate in 3, 2, 1. Panel, please hear this out very carefully. The topic for today's debate is, this House believes that no nation can survive being isolated, right? And the side opposition today has time and again mentioned Japan. Japan is a nation that has survived. Japan is a nation that has thrived, and Japan is a nation which is still thriving. member states, panel, please remember, Japan was a nation. Today, it is a nation state. Today, it is a nation state. There is a difference between being a nation and a nation state. Let us go with the definition of the side opposition. They said that Japan has thrived as a nation. Japan will always, Japan has thrived as a nation, even if you talk about the past context. Now, the topic says this house believes that no nation can survive being isolated. Nowhere does it state this house believes that no nation state can survive being isolated. Nowhere does it in the motion state, though this house believes that no state can survive being isolated. The motion states this house believes that no nation can survive being isolated. And Japan today is a nation state. Hence, the nation of Japan has not survived. The nation state of Japan is surviving and thriving. Moving on, they'd quite eagerly mentioned the example of Ethiopia. In the same way, in today's Ethiopia is a nation state and not a nation. Moving on, they had told us about how nations is what we're discussing today and not states and countries. So let's go on discussing nations. I am well aware of the fact that Kurds, Palestinians, and the people of Kosovo have been on the international level asking for not isolation, but globalization, recognition, and their own independence and their own recognition in today's world. Let's talk about the Kurds first. The Kurds had time and again requested the United Nations to intervene in whatever policies and whatever matters were being discussed in reference of Kurds. Let's talk about Palestine. Palestine was legally recognized in the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations General Assembly, right? Then you talk about how nations can survive being isolated. When Palestine decides to go to the United Nations General Assembly, it is not an action of isolation. It is an action of participation. It is an action of dialogue. Hence, we have proved to you how no nation can survive being isolated. Palestine itself has approached the United Nations General Assembly. What more proof do you want? Let's talk about Kosovo. Kosovo as a country has been recognized, Kosovo as a nation state has been recognized by a lot of countries around the world. Yet, you say that nations can survive being isolated. Kosovo highly depends via trade, via medicinal trade, via other interdependent aspects in this debate. Moving on. They had time and again mentioned the Ottoman Empire. They had time and again mentioned the Sentinelese tribe. The only question here is that the Sentinelese tribe live in an age of about 2 million years ago. They aren't thriving. Moreover, I was surprised to see that the second speaker from the side, opposition, had mentioned that their survival is them thriving. Panel, please know this, that surviving is not thriving. There is a huge difference between the concept of survival and thriving. Moreover, this debate today has not conceptualized. The side opposition has had a complete parallel debate. They did not intervene with one constructive of the side proposition, which means that they've conceded to what the side proposition believes. Now, the only concept of this debate which is left is the 17th to 19th century period, where we had nations. We don't have nations right now which are thriving or are in isolation. We have nation states which might be thriving. We have nations which aren't isolated. I had given you examples of Kosovo. I had given examples of Palestine. I had given you examples of the Kurdish people. As nation is an identity of autonomy, as you had rightly said. With this, I'd like to end my debate. Proud to propose.
The speaker exceeded the time limit by 10 seconds.
Anushka Agarwala has the first question for the rebuttal. I invite Anushka to ask her question.
Yes, sir. Speech, sir. So you as the third speaker said we're not debating nation states here. So we gave you an example of the Sentinelese tribe, which actually exists in 2021. Your second speaker came here and said we're debating countries. And so we gave you historical examples of countries which survived in isolation. So sir, could you please clarify your extremely confused stance? Because you seem to be talking about nations as a community. Your second speaker seems to be talking about countries as a nation state, and you all clearly don't have an argument.
Right. Thank you for your question. I'd like to answer your question with your question which you asked. You had said that we had talked about nations. We had talked about countries which had survived as nations. You had talked about countries which had survived as nations. There is a difference between a nation state and a nation, and that is exactly what we were trying to prove here. Moreover, my second speaker had talked about the Sentinelese time and again, because these people are not thriving. And your complete definition of surviving equating to thriving does not make sense to the side proposition, because from the side proposition, we believed that thriving is a principle where somebody progresses and develops over time, whereas there is no such data on the centenarians. Thank you.
The second question for the rebuttal is by Reva Sharma. Reva, go ahead, ask your question.
So your lead speaker twice in his speech said that to survive means to prosper. And now as the third speaker, you have come up here and you have said that to survive does not mean to thrive. Those who are familiar with the English language knows that thrive and prosper are practically synonymous. And that was your entire basis for dismissing a relevant example of the Sentinelese, a Stone Age tribe that still survived to this day. So can you please clear up the clear gaping holes in your team's argument?
Right, very clearly. Thank you, speaker, for your question. So the first speaker had mentioned that survival in today's world means to be set at a pedestal and not improve, whereas thriving is what we propose for. We mentioned that whenever you talk about survival, you have to talk about how a country cannot survive when we're talking about it in the context of isolation. Whereas when we talk about survival in your context, you have time and again stated the Sentinelese, and we can't understand the argument about how the Sentinelese are thriving when they're merely just surviving. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghav. I would now like to call upon the third speaker of the opposition, Sanaya Tulsian, to present her views on the topic.
Side proposition said, and I quote, "We are not talking about nations and are talking about countries." You said that we don't know the definition of nation, but sir, your second speaker conceded to our definition by saying this. Yes, sir, nations and countries are not equal. Thank you for understanding our point. A very good afternoon to everyone present here. As third speaker side opposition, it is my utmost prerogative to not only further the arguments of my side, but also deconstruct the absolutely baseless arguments put forth by side proposition. Side proposition today has come here and given us only one relevant example, which pertains to the United States of America, which also talks only about the future. So the past and the present are a part of this debate today. The future isn't. Today's side proposition came here and said that we can't talk about the past and can only talk about the present. They are A, narrowing the scope of today's debate, and B, propagating the extremely false notion that nations did not exist in the past and can only exist today. Nations have existed, sir, and they continue to do so. Let me give you a few examples to prove my point. Past, members of side proposition, do you remember your class 10 history syllabus? What was Swadeshi? What was boycott? Swadeshi was the concept of make in India to complement the boycott or isolation from the British. It was through this isolation form or boycott of British commodities that we fostered a sense of national belonging, one which never existed before. It is through isolation from a foreign ruler that we built a sense of national unity, and for the first time, Indians across the subcontinent felt as one nation hungry for self-determination. The boycott of foreign goods led to the increase in demand of indigenous goods, and a similar phenomenon was seen during the non-cooperation, the civil disobedience, and the Quit India movements. Isolating from the colonizers built a sense of nation and not destroyed it. Moving on to the present, Sir Bolivia, the Toromona are people who live near the upper Madadi River and the Heath Rivers in northwestern Bolivia. They occupy an exclusive, reserved, and inviolable portion of the Madidi National Park. Their main tactic is to isolate in order to survive. So Paraguay, approximately 100 Ayoreo people live there in that forest. They are nomadic and hunt, forage, and participate in agriculture. They are isolated and they live in the South Amazon basin, and they are currently still in Amatokodi. They are isolated. Yes, sir, they are surviving. Members of the House, today the burden of side proposition was to come to you and prove to you that not a single nation in the past or the present has survived after going into isolation. They have failed to give us a single example of a nation which has ceased to exist as a result of isolation. Today we have spoken about indigenous tribes, we have spoken about India, we have spoken about about Brazil, about Paraguay, about Japan, various nations, not only one, ladies and gentlemen. Our burden today was to prove to you that if even one nation in the history of humankind, which has adopted isolationism at some point and is still surviving today, the notion of no nation can survive falls flat on its face, ladies and gentlemen. Today, side proposition has come here and given a very mixed side to you. They have come here and confused definitions. They have come here with the first speaker saying something and the second speaker rebutting the speech of the first speaker. So please tell me how giving us a confused stance is going to help you carry today's debate. So they said, and I quote, "We are in isolation to survive the threat of a virus." So you are conceding to our argument. Surviving, we are living. So we went into isolation and therefore we survived. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
May I request the timekeeper to tell us how much time the speaker took?
Speaker exceeded by just 6 seconds.
The first question for the rebuttal is by Aviral Narang. I invite Aviral to ask his question.
Right, ma'am. I have a very simple question and I expect you to answer it in a yes or a no. Ma'am, do you agree that the motion today is that this House believes that no nation can survive being isolated, and not this House believes that no nation has ever survived being isolationist, which means that the motion itself is talking about the present scenario that we live in and not the past that you keep talking about?
So today, the word being in today's motion is a pervasive word. It talks about the past and the present. So I have reiterated 100 times that today the motion is, you are constricting and narrowing the scope of today's debate by only talking about the present. So we have given you numerous examples of not only the present, but also the past. I just gave you examples of the present. My lead speaker came here and gave you an example of 150 tribes who are isolated today and are still surviving. And therefore, how can you even prove that no nation or no community can survive as a result of being isolated? Thank you, sir.
The second question for the rebuttal is by Raghav Ranawat. I invite Raghav to ask his question.
Right. Thank you, Speaker, for the floor. Madam Speaker, in your speeches and your answers, I heard certain points and I'd like to reestablish them in today's debate. Seeing that you've agreed that a nation is not equal to a nation state, how is the nation of India before independence equal to the nation state of India? Hence, considering that the nation of India does not exist, rather the nation state of India exists. Moving on, can you please differentiate between community and nation, as you've completely confused them in context of centennials? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, sir, and thank you for giving me another opportunity to reiterate my point regarding Swadeshi and boycott. So understand that when the Britishers were in India, we had no sense of nation. The sense of an Indian nation did not exist. The very fact that we adopted Swadeshi and boycott, which was a sense of isolationism from the Britishers, gave us the whole community and the sense of creation of a nation of India, right? The civil disobedience, the Quit India, the non-cooperation movement, these were based on the very fact that India, the people, the community wanted to isolate themselves in order to survive, in order to create. So India itself, the nation of India, was created as a result of these movements. So you've just helped me prove my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanaya. I see a third hand up for the third question of the rebuttal. But unfortunately, we could allow again just 2 questions for it. So we won't be able to take up your question, Veer. I would now like to invite the principal speaker of side opposition, Anushka Agarwala, to sum up the team's arguments.
Greetings to the August House at large. The second speaker of side proposition kept calling side proposition side government so many times that he confused the concept of a nation with the concept of a state. And when he did that, he gave me an opportunity to give you examples of communities and real nations which exist in 2021 in complete isolation and are surviving. And like his lead speaker defined surviving to be thriving. Their third speaker had a very conflicted stance. He defined nation to be a community and not a nation state. And then, in order to refute the same, we again gave you an example, not just of these communities which exist at present, but communities which have existed historically. So therefore, members of the House, as we can already see, side proposition has done an exemplary job of not just confusing themselves, but us, and have not portrayed a single constructive, which is why we have clearly taken today's motion. Now with that, members of the House, let me delve into what we as side opposition propose to you today. The word surviving, from its very essence from the Cambridge Dictionary, is something which is not out of existence, something which is not destroyed. But here, as conceded by the third speaker of side proposition, it was something which was not destroyed. But their first speaker came and defined surviving as thriving. The side proposition has been so misconstrued with the concept of nation that they equated isolation to their simple international phone call, when nation in itself is just a community of individuals having a common origin. Now, in order to make things easier for the August House at large, allow me to read out today's motion word to word. No nation can survive being isolated. The word no in today's motion has brought about the absolute burden of side proposition, which they failed to prove to us. The word no meant that they have to prove that no community in the past or in the present, no community, no state in the history of humankind has ever survived a period of isolation, has ever come out of a period of isolation without being completely annihilated or destroyed. On the contrary, we as side opposition had to give you one simple example of any community of individuals throughout the history of humankind in the past or in the present, which have existed in isolation, and therefore members of the House, having successfully done so, we have taken today's debate. They said countries in the past were not countries because there was no democracy, because they were monarchies. Let me remind you that countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom in the present are also countries because they are monarchies. They have survived evolving from tribal nations which do exist as of 2021. We gave you examples, but they could not give us a single one. I spoke about the United States, the Ottoman empires through the 16th to the 18th century, tribes in Africa, tribes in the Uralic areas of Russia, Ethiopia, Persia, Harappans, Japan, and the examples are countless. Moving to our most important constructive of the right to self-isolation. The right to self-isolation is so important that it was recognized by the United Nations Human Rights Council and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. They spoke about the importance of globalization and cultural diversity, but they failed to realize that the right to self-isolation, which still exists and is in play with 150 tribes in the Amazon, is so important that that is the only thing which is saving the culture of those 150 tribes. Being in isolation is the only thing which is keeping them alive. Those 150 tribes are just a mere number in a present context. We spoke about Swadeshi and boycott, about how isolating ourselves from a foreign ruler built a community of Indians, built a sense of national community which never existed until the movements of Swadeshi and boycott were put into play. They spoke about not talking about states. So then we spoke about the Sentinelese and various other tribes, but they failed to acknowledge the same. Then they spoke about not speaking about communities. So we gave you concrete examples of actual states like Peru, Bhutan, and Paraguay who have exercised the right to self-isolation. Members of the House, with that, I'd like to rest my case, but not my stance. Thank you.
The speaker exceeded the time limit by 20 seconds.
I would now like to invite the principal speaker of side proposition, Aviral Narang, to sum up his team's arguments.
Right, thank you. I'll start my case in 3, 2, 1. Before this leaves my mind, ladies and gentlemen, UK is a constitutional monarchy, and there's a big difference between the monarchy that is in Saudi Arabia and the monarchy that is in United Kingdom. Monarchy in UK has a different role to that as that of in Saudi. Second question that they asked us, ladies and gentlemen, was one state that went into isolation and did not survive. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is no nation that has went into isolation and survived, because we cannot see an example. The nations that try to isolate themselves, they fail to survive, and that is why they had to come out of isolation. The side opposition today failed to understand the very basic meaning of isolation and decided to live in the past, ladies and gentlemen. Instead of providing us with arguments, the first speaker decided to utilize their time by telling us the difference between a state and a nation. They just presented the same word meanings that the side proposition provided to you, but in different words, right? Instead of providing us with any example where a country at the present moment is totally isolated and surviving, they decided to go for the word meanings. The principal speaker failed to understand the meaning of the word nation. So let me define it for them from the Oxford Dictionary. A country considered as a group of people with the same language, culture, and history who live in a particular area under one government. Meanwhile, a tribe is a social division in a traditional society consisting of families or communities linked by social, economic, religious, or blood ties with a common culture and dialect, typically having a recognized leader. So there is a difference between tribes and nations. Instead of rebutting the proposition by talking about the people people about where we are living today, they took us into the historical moments, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope that they understand that the tribe is not a nation. When they were questioned about an example of a nation which has been isolated and still survives, they told us how there are 150 tribes in the United States of America which are still isolated. Some fact checks, ladies and gentlemen. They talked about how Japan was in total isolation during the years that they mentioned. But ladies and gentlemen, during the very same years, Japan had treaty ties with Germany. The side opposition time and again failed to come to today's world and talk about the world today. They spoke about Sentinelese people, ladies and gentlemen. Let me bring to your notice that Sentinelese people are not a nation, but they are a tribe. They came up with the ideology of, if you can't convince them, confuse them. Because time and again, they got confused between how there is a difference between a tribe and a nation. I'm quite shocked how they fail to understand the world we live in today and talked about isolation in the world that we lived in hundreds of years ago. They failed to, when questioned why don't countries go into isolation now, they failed to reply and just focused on how the British made Andaman and Nicobar come out of isolation. Right? They failed to give us even one relevant argument, and instead of expressing their views on the topic or how a country's isolation is right now and not thriving, but instead of expressing their views on the topic, they were busy living in the world on denial. As I quote, the motion falls flat on the face, which it clearly does not. The side opposition took their whole debate on how nation states survive when they were isolated. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion today is that this House believes that no nation can survive being isolated, which means that the current world that we are living in, if we are isolated, we cannot survive during this time. The side opposition today decided to confuse the audience by not even understanding the meaning of the very motion today, and instead call the side proposition that we were trying to narrow the scope of the debate. Here are more problems that globalization solves, ladies and gentlemen. It gives people the global challenges that are, clean energy for all, water, sanitization for all, hygiene for all, better health checks, better health facilities for all. They failed to answer our questions on Kosovo, Palestine, and Kurdistan. They questioned us about how a nation has ceased to exist. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is a reason that the nations that were in isolation are out of isolation right now. And if they're out of isolation right now, ladies and gentlemen, even though it's very late to question them, I still do not get why they are not in isolation right now if they were excelling so much. If a country was excelling in isolation, why are they not excelling right now? They fail to give us one reason on how countries excel when they're isolated. They just said that these countries went into isolation and they excel. But they failed to make us understand how they will excel now. They did not give us a single reason on how countries, if they go into isolation now, will excel. What helps the countries survive? And whenever the side opposition was questioned, they started talking about tribes. Ladies and gentlemen, one final time, there is a difference between a nation and a tribe. With that is why we believe, ladies and gentlemen, the motion stands today and we are proud to propose.
The speaker exceeded the time limit by 20 seconds.
Thank you, Aviral. I hope the judges have sent across their scores for collation. I request them to do that. And while we wait for the scores to get collated, I would now like to invite the fourth speaker of the proposition, Vasu Sachdeva, to present his views on the topic.
Am I audible and visible?
Vasu, you're audible clearly.
Okay, ma'am, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon to the House at large. The topic for today's debate is this House believes that no nation can survive being isolated. Now, the side proposition comes and talks about how our nation under Mahatma Gandhi thrived and succeeded in making us independent and hence become a nation state. They do not consider the main idea behind Swadeshi movement was to become self-reliant and not isolation. And the nation was not completely isolated from the Britishers because there existed certain agreements which again rules out the possibility of them being considered as isolated. The side proposition believes in talking about the past and completely neglecting how many changes have taken place since the time, and then they say that we are narrowing the idea of this debate. Now, the side opposition has clearly failed to engage in us with this debate, and which is why we believe that our motion stands. Now, living in the globalized world where countries remain independent on each other, ladies and gentlemen, allows us to have greater variety of goods available for consumption. International trade brings in different varieties of particular product from different destinations. This gives consumers a wider array of choices, which will not only improve their quality of life, but as a whole, it will also help the nation grow. It also allows efficient allocation and better utilization of resources, since countries tend to produce goods in which they have a comparative advantage. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to make it clear: nation is historically constituted, while tribe is socially, ethically, and politically a cohesive group of people. We've stated it several times during the debate that there is no practical and live example of an isolated nation, because they understand that the individuals won't live a prosperous life if they tend to isolate themselves from the world. The isolation of a nation does not allow social, political, and economical exchange, which prevents mankind to learn from different kinds of people and enhance their way of living and prosper. The isolation of a nation also leads to family separation. I'm talking about nation and not tribes, and prohibits refugee intake. This does not only define on how it is economically not viable, but it also shows that it does not withstand the moral standards, because as an isolated country, you do not care about the refugees of other countries, and their lives are devalued by both the countries concerned, thus not letting them live prosperously. With this, I would like to rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasu. I would now like to invite the fourth speaker of the proposition, Reva Sharma, to present her views on the topic.
Even today, a country like Taiwan has yet to be recognized by the United Nations, the European Union, and the majority of the world. They live in a state of diplomatic isolation. However, in recent times, Taiwan was credited with having impressive success battling the coronavirus pandemic, during which time it prospered as a nation. However, according to side proposition stance, an isolated country cannot even survive, much less defeat a virus. A very good afternoon to this illustrious House at large. As fourth speaker of side opposition, allow me to reiterate and further substantiate the crux of my team's argument. Firstly, allow me to revisit the absolute nature of today's motion, which we discern from the word no. What side proposition is therefore trying to say that not a single nation can survive being isolated. Their burden of proof is to say that any nation that has at any point implemented an isolationist policy cannot have survived and cannot exist today. Members of the House, today's side opposition has facilitated you with not just one, but a myriad of examples. China, the USA, Japan, Paraguay, not to mention the hundreds of uncontacted and isolated tribes that still survive and, yes, thrive and prosper as well to this day. Secondly, let us understand isolationism as a foreign policy concept. Typically, nations enter into this because they do not wish to be involved in some dangerous and undesirable conflict, or perhaps because they want to avoid entering into an international trade agreement or mutual assistance pact. Or in other words, the reasons nations enter into isolationism is to further and serve their best interests. Today, side proposition has managed to contribute precious little to today's debate, apart from making grammatical mistakes, misreading the motion, and stubbornly denying time and time again that fact and evidence cannot hold true just because it is not happening at this very second. With that, I believe side opposition has come to a satisfying conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Reva. So with this, while the scores get collated, I would like to invite the judges to express their views on the topic for the debate today, on the quality of the discussion, and just their thoughts on the debate. I'm sure all the participants would want to hear from you. So the judges, I'd like to invite you to express your views.
I go first?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. Thank you for having me once more. It is very nice to see young people arguing in a rational manner. Today, the world is filled, especially now, is filled with a cacophony of voices, and this dissonance all over the place, people talking at one another rather than to one another. So it's very nice to see young people, talking to each other in a very mature way, trying to be as reasoned in their arguments as possible. So well done, both teams. I have a special affinity for both the teams, the Martinet girls, because I'm from Calcutta, myself, a Kolkata, and Mayo College, because my son is from there. He's an ex-student of Mayo College, Ajmer. So you can see there's an emotional connect to both the schools. One thing I felt, you people, there was isolation and disengagement are two different things. And I felt that was perhaps, confused somewhere. And I wouldn't like to take up hog all the time, but may I just read? Being a literature teacher, whenever I get a chance, I like to read out something that John Donne, poet, philosopher, who was a priest also for a short time, wrote in the 17th century. It's very short. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of your friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. In today's pandemic situation, I think more than isolation, we are forcefully isolated, all right? But I don't think we are very happy being isolated. Thank you for having me here and for the maturity of the interchange of ideas that I was privy to.
Thank you, ma'am, for those wise words. More from the judges?
Okay, may I?
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah. I appreciate what ma'am just said, and thank you for having me here. And I really appreciate the speakers this afternoon, their gusto, their enthusiasm. I particularly enjoyed their rebuttals and, the way they went at it. But I think I'm a little disappointed not to hear from them talking of certain countries that I believe have been isolated. Maybe today they may not be, but like the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and Iran. I found no mention about Iran and North Korea particularly. And apart from the way in which the who wins the motion this afternoon, based on the results and the show of hands of the House, my personal belief is whether you are isolated or not isolated, whether, I think you will still survive. A nation still survives. That's all I would like to humbly submit. Thank you once again for allowing me to say a few words. And I'd like to really appreciate La Martiniere Lucknow for inviting me to be on this panel. Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers. I particularly appreciated the way in which the young set of organizers I wouldn't like to mention his name, but he was in constant touch with me. And that was something I really admired. It's quite a far cry from the day in which I have been involved with schools. And I really appreciate the way in which he coordinated these events, and credit to Mr. Siddiqui also. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir, for your words. Mr. Noble, would you want to share a few words with us as well?
Certainly, I am sitting here and I'm very overwhelmed by the quality of this debate. The Claude Barton debates are the best in the country, and then to reach the finals of this national debate, the two teams over here, Bayer College Ajmer and La Martinique's Kolkata, you've proven that you are the best among the best. I was very enthralled, very impressed by the way you took on certain points, refuted arguments, and also took on questions from the opposition. And I see a lot of maturity in some of you being, news anchors or politicians, you may call it. The fact that when a question was asked to you, all right, you said, thank you so much for asking the question. You've just proven that you were not listening to me, or you've given me an opportunity to express my points a little more clearly over there. It shows the manner in which you're able to engage an audience there. As Dr. Coutinho mentioned, it would be nice if you could have also had a little more diverse areas of the topic, just like you could have mentioned Iran and North Korea. I was really looking forward to some of the situations of the present. Now, the topic does say about whether a nation can survive. Now, can survive is will survive, which is the future of a nation based on the past and the present situation. I heard a bit of a war between the past and the present over there. And I would have loved to have heard a little bit more about, Brexit, Boris Johnson's argument for Brexit, the opposition's argument against it, the Scottish referendum and their reasons for not having it. Also the fact that isolation is sometimes not self-inflicted or a personal choice. It can also be imposed by other nations by way of sanctions, and the pressure on certain nations to conform to certain ways based on sanctions, based on a forced isolation over there. I saw a lot of examples of the Sentinelese tribes and maybe the indigenous tribes of Brazil, which by choice are isolated, but mind you, they're also protected by certain government policies for non-interference as well over there. So there were great sides on both sides of the argument. I can't wait. I'm on the edge of my seat, although I've been a judge over here, to hear the final result, because it's been very close. There's some great speakers over here, great thoughts, and a lot of empathy, a lot of connect with the audience. I've been watching on video the debates you've had in the past in the auditorium, but to be able to conduct this on screen virtually is really a feat of La Martiniere, and hats off to the organizing committee for really pulling it off with the best quality that could be expected. Thank you very much, and good luck to all of you, and to the best speakers. May the best one win.
Thank you, sir. I would now like to, throw the floor open, invite any faculty members, teachers, members of the organizing committee to share their views with us. It would be really nice to hear you, and I'm sure the participants would also like to get more feedback from the esteemed faculty members and members of the organizing committee. So do we have anyone else who would want to share their views? It would be really nice for the participants to hear more from the La Martiniere faculty and the organizing committee team members. All right, since nobody's coming up, let me take this opportunity to share a piece of my mind with everyone. To begin with, since eventually I would also be disclosing the results and declaring the winning team, to begin with, let me take this opportunity to congratulate both the teams, all the speakers of both the teams, for such a passionate debate and discussion. It's amazing to see such a well-informed, well-researched discussion and such compelling arguments being presented by such young minds. And as the judges also mentioned, it's very encouraging to see such mature engagement and discussions which such young children are engaging in as of today. So I'd like to believe that, the country is in good hands of people who are young minds, who are thinking, who are using their cognition to engage in such diverse issues and topics, and investing so much of energy in thinking about them and discussing about them. So it's very encouraging to see such young minds coming up and discussing and engaging in such dialogues. Very important for us to engage in such dialogues. Along with that, let me also say that, well, one team has to win. It's a competition at the end of the day, and one team has to win, unfortunately. One rarely comes across such, cutthroat competition, such ambitious arguments being offered, such passionate speeches. And I must say that this clearly was one such experience for me. Both the teams were amazing. Both the teams had, very compelling arguments to make. I just hope that it was a discussion which kept me on my edge and constantly kept me listening to the arguments. And I hope that this was as fun a session for everyone present here as it was for me. So it was lovely hearing such young minds coming together on such areas of discussion, such out of the box thinking that these young minds are engaging in. So that was my thought while I was listening to the arguments, while I was listening to the speakers as they were presenting their arguments. So with the floor open, any other participants, any other speakers who would want to build up on the debates or the arguments that they've offered so far? Anything else that you'd want to say? So there was a time limit, a major time limit to the extent to how much you could speak, but now you have the opportunity to present your views, further build up on your arguments. So maybe use this opportunity to share a little more of what you think with the viewers. I did see Raghav nodding religiously while I was saying yes. So I was waiting for that hands up. I saw him nodding vigorously. Go ahead, Raghav.
I was nodding, yes.
Yeah,
I do
go
have
ahead.
certain things to say,
Yes.
but I feel like now that the debate has ended, I would just like to point out wherever we could have done better in the debate, both the sides. I mean, constructive feedback of some kind, if you'd like to say that. Otherwise, right. So I like to start off with pointing out that there was visible confusion about the definition of nation and nation states, countries, as one might say, and also there was differentiation between tribes and communities. So there was a conflict between the definition of tribes and communities, which I feel like could have been explained better by the side opposition. Moreover, I feel like the constructors, which the first speaker had quite repeatedly mentioned, were not tackled. And otherwise, I feel like it was a good debate. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghav. What about the girls? We have the boys speaking up. What about the girls? Yes, Ria.
I think this debate was rather like a rhetorical table tennis match. We were just going back and forth on what the motion entailed. So I think both teams spent a large majority of our time discussing simply what the motion entails. And while we did provide constructive examples regarding the past and the present, we felt that examples weren't exactly provided by the other side, but at the same time, we did spend a lot of time discussing the motion and what the motion entailed.
Right. Thank you, Ria. Judges, would you have a take on what the participants have to say?
Absolutely. I must commend Raghav. Now that the judges sheets are in, it's you're free to look back for self-criticism and on the flaws of your own team as well, and ask for constructive criticism over there. Raghav, I must commend you on having great listening skills. I felt you were really listening to what the speaker said over there, and I was very impressed with two googlies that you threw, one to Anushka, who deflected it very well, and another one to Ria over there. The art of debating is sometimes like a martial art, right? Where it's more than the power of your own fist or your own punch. Is using the power of your opponent, right? Like Aikido or Jiu-Jitsu or Judo, okay, and using that force to trip them up over there. And a lot of you are trying that. I like the fact there's a lot of a debate is not an argument, but an agreement. Really, at the end of it all, if the two parties, and that's where the future of all nations lie, in constructive debate. And if two parties can actually come to an agreement as a result of a debate, then of course the objective has been achieved over there. What really works in a person's favor is something very hard to give. It's very easy to put your points across. If you believe in something, you want to hammer it on, hammer the opposition for the mistakes they made in the argument. But very few are able to do this one trick, and that is concession. Can a speaker concede what an opponent has said? Can you take one point of the argument and agree to it? Maybe this is a good time if Isha, if you would allow us, ask each of the teams to concede one point of what the opponent spoke of. If they were convinced on at least one point over there, what point would they concede? That makes you more enduring and more credible to be listened and to be believed.
Absolutely, sir. So we begin with the boys. Mayo College, would you want to go ahead first? Talk about one point that you agreed at with the other team. Yes, Abir.
Listen, at least I did not agree with anything the side, not government side, opposition has said. Probably my teammates differ, but the only one, and they've continuously told us how we've not listened to their speech. I want to assure them that I have heard everything you have said. But ma'am, now that I would like to ask them if that now the debate is over and this is a very informal chat. Can they at least now give us one real-time example of a country not confusing the definition of a nation or nation state, a country who has gone into isolation and has thrived?
So, may I? So when you think of what happens with Iran, when the United States cuts off all diplomatic ties, when it forces other nations to cut off all economic ties, and the very fact that Iran, within a state of isolation in the past few years, was actually able to build up nuclear reactors, when even the United Nations decided to issue sanctions against Iran and put them in isolation. The very fact that Iran not just built up nuclear reactors, but also progressed and increased their oil production by 30% in those 5 years when they were in isolation before the JCPO came into place is another current example. And you spoke about countries yet again. So the debate has ended, and you yourself conceded to the fact that a nation is not a country, as was brought out by all your speakers. So, sir, a nation is not a country. I'm repeating this for the benefit of everyone here. A nation is a community of people, and we gave you numerous examples of communities of people. And tribes are also communities of people, which very much did exist back then and do exist now. Thank you.
Abir, would you want to respond to that?
I'm not going to rebut because I don't want to waste everyone's time. But thank you, ma'am. It was an amazing debate. I think that probably my teammates want to say something.
Yes, Raghav's hand is up. Raghav, would you want to
Yes.
say something?
Firstly, I'd like to talk about how Madam Speaker from the side opposition said about how what she said was completely true, that the US had put sanctions on Iran, and this had forced some countries to. So the US had given out an ultimatum, and it did force some countries to choose between US or Iran. That is true. Also, I feel like when we defined being isolated, we talked about no participation in any international organization or any international dialogue. So if you give an example of Iran, you yourself mentioned the JCPOA. So we think that discussing being isolated in the modern day world is quite conflicted from both the sides. Something I agree with them is upon certain countries and certain. So when they said that tribes are nations or communities are nations, I somewhat agree to that, because the definition of nation somewhat matches the definition of tribe and somewhat matches the definition of community, but does not exactly match it. I mean, there isn't a confirmation about how this matches one another. Moreover, I feel like one point was really irrelevant here when they had started citing the acts from the 17th century to the 19th century. Also, when they said that Japan was isolationist because Japan did have a lot of trade with countries during that time. Moreover, Japan was a nation that time, and currently it is a nation state. And Japan as a nation did not survive, but Japan as a nation state is surviving. Nation state.
May I fact check that? So when you're talking about Japan having trade ties, they had trade ties with Germany in the 20th century. We spoke about the 16th to the 19th century, where under the Shokugawa shogunate, which I don't know whether you've heard of or not, the imperial dynasty of Japan, they actually had no contact with any other country. Furthermore, you yourself said that Japan was a nation then and they did survive. The very fact that Japan as a concept, Japanese culture, Japanese ethnicity still exists. You just conceded to our point yet again.
One last point of clarification. So when you said that Japanese nation did survive, it survived for a brief period, for a long period of time. Let's say, for the benefit of this debate, it survived for a long period of time, but it was put to an end when the nation state of Japan came up. That is what I was trying to prove throughout my speech. But just let me finish. When I said that you talk about Japan being a nation, you talk about Ethiopia being a nation, we agree that these nations survived, but we do not agree to the fact that these nations have but we do not agree that these nations have survived until now, because these aren't nations anymore. Because by your clear definition of nation, we assumed that by nations you mean countries, or by nations you mean communities which are autonomous and which don't have a democratic system of governance. So when we talk about Japan, we talk about a nation state and not a nation. That's all.
Okay, so if I can just clarify that with a more relatable example. The Republic of India is a nation state. The Indian community, Indians of people of Indian origin living in Canada or the United States are also people of the Indian nation. So a nation can exist simultaneously with a nation state. Whether a country has sovereignty, whether a country is internationally recognized, does not take away from the community of people who have a common culture, who have a common history and a common bloodline or ethnicity. They can coexist. So when you're saying that the nation state of Japan coming into existence killed the Japanese nation, it does not stand, because we still have Indians living in Canada, in UK, and in the US, and they may be known as NRIs, but they're still parts of the Indian nation, which still exists, even though the Republic of India simultaneously exists.
All right, speakers, thank you for that added on discussion. I do have the results with me, and I'm assuming that everyone's keenly waiting for the results. So without wasting much more time, let me just get straight to the results and announce the results. So here we go. The motion has been defeated. The winning team is La Martiniere for Girls, Kolkata. The best speaker for the final debate has been jointly won by Abir Srivastav and Raghav Singh Ranawat of Mayo College, Ajmer. We have another set of winning speakers, which is the best speaker of the tournament. So the best speaker of the tournament has been jointly won by Anushka Agarwala of La Martiniere for Girls, Kolkata, and Advika Narayan Shukla of the Sri Ram School, Molsari. So those were the results for you. Congratulations to all the winners. And like I said, that all speeches were extremely compelling. Everyone did a great job. But at the end of the day, one has to win since it's a competition. So congratulations to all the participants. And with that, this brings us to the end of the debate. I hope that it was as enjoyable for everyone, all the participants and the judges, as it was for me. So with that, thank you again to all the judges and all the participants for joining us today, for making time for us, all the judges. Thank you again. And so as the chairperson, I now declare the debate closed. Thank you.